Welcome to My Life Chassidus Applied, episode 576. This program is in loving memory of Miriam Baselio Altes, Aleh Shalom, and in merit of Baruch ben Yaman ben Menucha Lana Altes, Yukusil ben Leah Rachel, and Rachel Bas Liba Farkash, dedicated by Pinchas Tadris ben Miriam and Sarah Bas Rachel Altes. So we are now in the third week of the month of Teves. This week is the special day of Dalet Teves, the hilula, histalkus of the Alter Rebbe in the year Chof and Gimel. Be 213 years ago. And as well as Frumer Vaeirah. So as has become our custom, we will discuss the Chassidus applied of this special day, as well as of this week's parsha, and also address many questions that have come in. Some are timely, some are timeless. In Torah, everything that's timely becomes timeless. Everything that's timeless is timely. And thank you again for your questions, which is the driving engine of this program. Good time to announce, ChassidusApplied.com is our website, where there's a forum that you can submit any question you like anonymously. All questions are acceptable. Nothing is taboo, nothing off limits. And as I said, your questions are what feed this program. So with that, let us begin with Dalet Teves. We mentioned it last week as well in context of the yahrzeit of the Rambam on Chof Teves. The Rebbe connects the two. But we'll focus now on Dalet on the 24th of Teves. As I said, this is the hilula, histalkus yahrzeit of the Alter Rebbe. So to begin with, whenever we talk about a hilula, the best place to look is the Alter Rebbe himself, paskind what exactly a hilula of a tzaddik is. We have in the Geras HaKedesh 2 letters, Siman Chof Zayin and its Biur, and Siman Chof Ches that talk about the hilula of a tzaddik. These are letters the Alter Rebbe wrote to different communities when they were dealing with the tzaddikim in their generation, in their time. Briefly, the Alter Rebbe writes, and we'll start with the Geras HaKedesh Siman Chof Zayin. He writes, statement from the Zohar that a tzaddik is present even greater after his passing than during his lifetime as a neshama beguf, because he's no longer limited and contained in the body. And being that the chayif of tzaddik, the life of a tzaddik, is not chayim psarim, not matter, it's not physical life, it's chayim ruchim, spiritual life, ava and yira and amuna. So once the gashmis, the body, is no longer there, the ruchnius now doesn't have any containment, and therefore its power continues to affect, especially his talmidim, as the Alter Rebbe elaborates upon there at length. Then Siman Chof Ches, he discusses how by a day of a hilula, all the Aveda, all the work that the Tzaddik did throughout his lifetime, all elevates together to the highest levels, and it's mamshich and poyel Yeshua's bekerev haaretz. It affects and impacts salvations, Yeshua's tshuah, and redemptions bekerev haaretz, not just on earth, but bekerev, in the depths of the earth, even in the darkest places. So when it comes Chof Dalet Teves, that's exactly what we have with the Alter Rebbe. So all the Aveda and all the Torah and everything the Alter Rebbe taught and learned, and all his work, and of course the establishment of Chassidus Chabad, Tanya, and all the maamorim, and everything the Alter Rebbe left us is Peil Yeshua's bekerev haaretz. It elevates and brings down Yeshua's to each one of us, each one individual, to our families, to our communities. And so that itself is already a tremendous thing, tremendous brachas and a yom zgula like that. We also have a day, it's a day when we can connect even deeper to the Alter Rebbe, as the Alter Rebbe explains. So the best way to do so is to talk about the Torah of the Alter Rebbe, because I know nafshi ksavis yehovis, the Alter Rebbe invested himself, he infused himself in the Torah, engraved and etched his very soul in the Torah that he taught. So on a day like Dalet Teves, in general, when we learn Chassidus Chabad, we are manifesting the Alter Rebbe in our lives. And when you follow the Alter Rebbe's directives, and that's the Torah, and Havaya, and Gemilas Chasadim, and in actions, that's the best way to honor and to celebrate and to take advantage of all this power that we have in this day of Dalet Teves. What lessons do we learn from the Alter Rebbe's hilula? So, just to sum up some of the Rebbe's ideas and thoughts on Dalet Teves, Merum is in the Alter Rebbe's name. His name is Shnei Zalman, Shnei Oyer, two light, two levels of light. The Oyer of Niglul Torah, Oyer of Primis Torah. Shnei Oyer, but as they join as one word, as one name. The light Niglul Torah, we have of course the Shulchan Aruch of the Alter Rebbe, and in Primis Torah, the Oyer of Nister Torah, we have Tanya and all the maamorim Chassidus that the Alter Rebbe delivered. And they come together, and then as the Rebbe's father explains, and they're nimshach, we said, B'kerev ha'aretz, down below, in Zman and Mokim, in time and space. And it doesn't, in other words, it doesn't just remain a lofty experience, but it's something that permeates and penetrates this very earth, which is defined by time and space. Zman and Mokim, that's Lizman, Zalman, the second name of the Alter Rebbe. So Shneier, the Oyer, of the highest levels of Oyer, of Oyer Torah Oyer, both the Oyer of Niglul, Oyer of Primis, as one, and that is Nimshach in the Zman, in Zalman, in Zman of this, of all existence, and including of this world. So on a day like this, we learn about how to bring together these two forces. And we'll be discussing as we get closer to Yud Shvat, the gili of the Eitzres, of the treasures, the divine treasures that are given to us to fight the battles where, B'kerev ha'aretz, in this lowest of worlds. So in a way, Dalet Teves captures that name, that it's a Hamshacha of the highest levels of Oyer, Shnei Oyer, into Zman, into the space and time, into time and space of this world. So that is one among many, many lessons. Additionally, I would say, being that the Alter Rebbe was Moshe Nefesh in establishing Chassidus Chabad and giving us the Tanya and giving us all the Chassidus that he literally innovated, Kemuvan, everything based on the Torah that he had received from his teachers and from the generations past. So the greatest way to celebrate Dalet Teves is in Yefutza Meinasecha Chutza, in spreading these teachings, continue to spread them, continue to teach them, and show their relevance. Korav Elecha Dover Meid, their personal relevance to every person in their lives. What were the circumstances that led to the Alter Rebbe's passing? Okay. So, put it a little into context. We know that the Alter Rebbe, the story with the Alter Rebbe's daughter, Rebbetzin Dvoiraleya, the mother of the Tzemach Tzedek, that there was a point where there was a Gzeira, and she recognized that the Alter Rebbe was going to be taken to heaven. And she called a Bezdin quietly, and she had them paskin that she should give her life for her father. And therefore, the Alter Rebbe continued living, and of course, a special attention to her son, the Tzemach Tzedek. Famous story with Dvoiraleya. But the fact is, Alter Rebbe had to continue living, doing his shlichus and his avodah, and it says he would have even gone longer than after Tov Kufay and Gimel. But it was due to the events that took place in the world at the time, namely Napoleon. Napoleon had, in those years, went and attacked Russia, famous Franco-Russia war, that began a little before the Alter Rebbe's histalkus. As a result, Alter Rebbe had to run away from the Yadi, because by no means did he want to be conquered and taken under control of Napoleon. We'll talk about the reason for that in a moment. So he went on literally in exile. He ran. We know even the path he took, called the Masa Achrin, his last journey. And due to this journey, both physically and spiritually, is ultimately that caused the histalkus to happen, as the Rabbeim tell us, that it happened prematurely, that he should have lived longer. So the question, of course, is obviously physically, running and on the road and all the challenges involved can take a toll. But we know that everything is momaila. The ruchnis, what was it that would be such a powerful thing that can affect the Alter Rebbe, Rabbeinu HaGadol, Neshama Chadosha, and all that he had brought to the world, and had so much more to bring, that would cause such that he should end his life should end b'chaim chayusi b'al medain prematurely. So this goes back to understanding what exactly Napoleon stood for. Remember, the Sarei Ha'elam, meaning the leaders and kings, Lev Melachim V'Sarim B'Yad Hashem. These are designated by God. And as a result of that, they all have a mazel l'mayla. The Teves Shalom, the Rebbe Rashab talks about it. Especially the larger countries, the superpower, so to speak, have a mazel, just like Pare had, just like Esav has. So throughout the generations, Bovel, Rome, and the same thing in the times of the Alter Rebbe. The Russian Tsar, Alexander, Napoleon, the Emperor of France, all represented forces. Now interesting, both come from Esav, both are part of Malchus Edom, the Golas Edom, but they still represented different approaches. And we know the famous story how the Alter Rebbe did everything possible to make sure that Alexander should win the war. The famous story, Rosh Hashanah, in the morning, he woke up early, got a minyan, and blew shofar earlier in order to prevail that the Russians should win the war. Why? Because as the Alter Rebbe writes in his letter, famous letter, he writes to Moshe Meisels, one of his chassidim, great chassidim, that, and then the Mittler Rebbe has even a longer letter that elaborates on it, that Napoleon represented godlessness. Yes, he came to offer freedom, fraternity. So even though it would have been physically easier for the Jews under Napoleon, under France, but spiritually it would have been a much bigger compromise, much more threat. As we see, even with Napoleon losing, how assimilation ravaged the Jewish community. So the Alter Rebbe felt that even though Alexander would be more difficult for the Jews, but Baruchnius, we weren't yet ready to face and live in a world like France. As the Rebbe explains it at length in the famous Sikha Vayeshev Tavshinun Beis, it was like Yaakov and Esav, that Yaakov wasn't ready to live side by side with Esav. The children are too young, the sheep are tender, which means that we don't have the ruchnistic maturity to be able to enter. And that's why indeed in history you find that the Jews lived in insulated environments. Not that simple to engage with the material world, a Gentile world that was antithetical to godliness. In earlier generations, Avodah Zarah, paganism, and later generations, enlightenment, which also was trying to replace God. Then the Rebbe says, 7 generations later, meaning the Rebbe's generation, Der Ashvi, now we could enter into France and transform the Western world. But at Alter Rebbe's time, Napoleon represented like the Pari of that time, the Reisha Klippe. He calls him that. He says strong words about how we mentioned Keichi ve'etzim yadi, that we man are more powerful than everything. And the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe, as I mentioned, elaborates, and these letters are printed in the Igris today of the Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, but also printed originally in Beis Rebbe. So for the Alter Rebbe, Napoleon wasn't just an individual thing. It was a cosmic thing. It was an archetype. Shezeh comes and Nefel, the Yaakov and Esav battle, that both cannot coexist. And he saw Napoleon as a direct threat to the Ruchni's Veda of Yidden. Again, today is a different story. But then that was the story. So his not wanting to be conquered by Napoleon was critical. Because he did not want to be under the subjugation of a godless leader like that. So he ran. There are places, I remember when I was in Smolensk, I saw there's a place where they say the Alter Rebbe was hiding. And Napoleon knew of the Alter Rebbe. We know that too. Not only that, Moshe Meisels, the Chassid, was actually sent by the Alter Rebbe to be a spy for the Russian government in order to understand what's going on with the French tactics and strategies. Famous stories involved around that. So that was the Alter Rebbe. So therefore, it's not a surprise that as a result of running from Napoleon, it actually caused ultimately the Alter Rebbe's histalkus earlier than it should have been. In Kfar Piena, that's where it was. There's a very powerful letter from the Tzemach Tzedek, printed in the Tzemach Tzedek's Igres letters, where he talks about that night, Chavdal Teves, that year was Mitzvah Shabbos, like he writes that it was Mitzvah Shabbos Parsha Shmeis, Ayim Aleph of Parsha Vaeirah, and a little while after Avdolah Shabbos, that Mitzvah Shabbos, the Alter Rebbe made Avdolah, and then was the histalkus. So there's a letter, a very powerful letter. I spoke about it a while ago. I'm not going to go over it now again, but it's worthwhile looking up of how he was davening at the Amid Fermaydiv that Tzemach Tzedek was. And he was very depressed because he saw depressed. He was Morosh Cheredik. He was down because he saw the Alter Rebbe was suffering, and it was like he saw it was the end. The Alter Rebbe called him over and told him that he heard from his Rebbe, the Magid, that that the face you show below is reflected above. So when you show a smiling face, so you get a smiling face in return. When you show a sad face, you get a sad face in return. This may be the last thing the Alter Rebbe said before the histalkus. Tzemach Tzedek has a whole letter how our thoughts shape our realities. So it's all part of the story in Kfar Piena. Now we also have some things we know the Alter Rebbe wrote right before the histalkus. Tremendous chidushim. There's the famous letter Nefesh Hashvela. There's also the Geras HaKedah Siman Chof. Literally tremendous chidushim that were written, as the Tzemach Tzedek writes, days or weeks before the histalkus. And so all this was, on one hand, yes, it was due to Napoleon, due to the Snagdus, the Alter Rebbe putting all his energy to fight this klipa that ultimately caused the histalkus. But the Alter Rebbe also left us with tremendous resources, especially when you read the Geras HaKedah and Nefesh Hashvel, and the Rebbe explains the connection between both of them. The Maila of Aveda down here below, Yesh HaNivra, Mitzise Matzmusei, Oir Me'en Amoyer, real chidushim of the Alter Rebbe that he left us with, which often happens out of a challenge comes the greatest chidushim. So that's all connected to Chavdal Teves. Someone asks, how was it related to him fleeing Napoleon's advance? So we talked about the circumstances that led to the Alter Rebbe's passing, how it was related. So I just explained how it was related due to the klipa of Napoleon. Is there a connection between the Alter Rebbe returning to retrieve a pair of slippers so they not fall into the hands of Napoleon, and Jacob returning to retrieve the small vessels? So we know there's a famous story that the Alter Rebbe went back because as he was escaping the advance of Napoleon, he had left slippers, he had left something of his own possessions, and he didn't want that to be in the hands of Napoleon. Now why? Because the chafetzim of a tzaddik have high nitzutzi gedusha, and he didn't want to give any energy to the tzatzah keneged, to the negative side. So he went back. So the question is here, is it compared to Yaakov going back for the pachim ktanim, for the small vessels, when he crossed the river and had his whole family cross over as they were escaping, preparing for war with Esav, is it comparable? So I'm almost sure that the Rebbe compares the two, but maybe not. But either way, it's definitely comparable, because Yaakov and Esav represent the same idea. Yaakov is like the Alter Rebbe, and Esav, Napoleon stems, Edom, Malchus Edom, Golas Edom. And the B'Shum Ephraim didn't want that these Pachim Ktanim, which also is connected to the sparks, the divine sparks that belong to Yaakov, should be fall into the hands of the other. In this case, by Yaakov, he ended up also wrestling with the angel of Esav. The same idea, to conquer the negative energy of the other side and ultimately transform it. But at this point, it was still a story of him protecting, because he didn't want the other side, the negative side, to control. At this point, the Alter Rebbe felt the best is to avoid it. Later, 7 generations, we can transform it. But we do have, of course, the story of Napoleon's march. That the Alter Rebbe transformed, they say, Napoleon's march became, even though it was a march of Napoleon, that represented Napoleon's approach, it became a Chassidus Shenig. The Rebbe compared that to singing of Aderes V'Amunah in the French anthem. France, again, Napoleon. The French anthem, Tov Shalom Dalet Simchas Tedim. So all this you see a much more cosmic picture than just the individual events of the time that affect even today. Because we're still dealing with a Western world. We still need to finish the job to bring the Gula. Now we have much more Kayach, and we all the Eitzidus as well, the treasures that are splurged to us. And now we have the power to enter into France, enter into Edom, into the thick of things, and transform it. And you see the Mapecha that Taka happened. The Baal Tshuva movement and the whole Mapecha revolution, Torah Kedusha, that happened, and Taka from France became Haderes V'Amuna L'Chai Elomim, Habina V'Abrocha L'Chai Elomim. Okay. And as the Rebbe explains in that Sikha Vayeshev Nun Beis, that Yaakov also first thought that Esav was ready, but then he realized he's not. The Rebbe compared that first the Alter Rebbe saw that Napoleon wasn't ready, meaning that France wasn't ready, but now they are. And that's the Rebbe brings the Haftarah from Parsha Vayishlach Tzarfas, which is also the letter Faratzta. So transforming France into Faratzta Yom HaVaked B'Tzafein V'Negba. Being that we're talking about Chavdala Teves, which of course brings up many questions, especially connected also to Yutes Kislev. So I'll cover a few questions that could have been discussed Yutes Kislev, but we'll talk about it now. Why was the Alter Rebbe on spiritual trial for teaching Chassidus, which is the story behind Yutes Kislev? As somebody writes it this way. It's taught that the trial of the Alter Rebbe in the Russian courts mirrored a spiritual trial there, where he was accused of teaching and spreading too much Chassidus. I don't understand how this makes sense. 2 generations earlier, Mashiach himself told the Baal Shem Tov that the Gula will arrive after the wellsprings of Chassidus are spread to the outside. So already in the Baal Shem Tov's generation, it was told what has to be done. So the Alter Rebbe was just following instructions that Mashiach himself gave. And if someone wants to say maybe it was because the Alter Rebbe taught too much Chassidus to too many people, that also doesn't make sense. Because the instructions from Mashiach to the Baal Shem Tov didn't contain limitations. It said, spread it to the outside. It didn't say spread it to the outside, but be careful to do just a little and not too much. So clearly the Alter Rebbe did absolutely nothing wrong. This is also confirmed by his release from the Russian courts and simultaneously in the Heavenly Court. And yes, the celebration of Yutes Kislev is Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus. But unfortunately, he had to suffer 53 days in deplorable conditions in jail due to a false accusation. I feel the Alter Rebbe was wronged and deserves compensation for the suffering he endured. The best way to compensate him is for the heavenly courts to proclaim an official ruling that Mashiach must come today. Amen. Absolutely. On a side note, I want to say I love the Alter Rebbe's maamorim and Likkutei, and I want to say thank you to the Alter Rebbe for teaching them. Studying them gives me new amazing intuitions in Torah and have transformed me into a better person than I was in the past. Thank you, Alter Rebbe. Okay. So there are different ways this question is posed, but I'll tell you, this just underscores everything we're talking about. Yes, of course, the Alter Rebbe was doing exactly, that's why he did it. He was doing exactly what he was taught by the Maggid and by the Baal Shem Tov before him. But that doesn't mean it comes easily. There's always the Zelu Umazeh. The Eibishter made opposition because the stakes are so high. Just like Adam and Chava in the Gan Eden, they had to deal with Anocha Shakadmaini, who was very powerful, and seduced them and convinced them to eat from the tree of knowledge. After Matan Torah, the Yidden are such a high level. Matan Torah, Mamish. Yem Chasanos is at Matan Torah. And comes the Chet HaEgel. It's not so simple. There's always a challenge. In this case, Chas v'Sholom, it didn't come with any Chet, but it came with an opposition. All the forces on the other side said, oh, the Alter Rebbe, look what he's doing. Can we bring the Geula? But we have all kinds of reasons, comes the Klip and Sitrach, to be Mekatrik, to complain and prosecute and file a complaint in heaven, that maybe it's not the time. People will abuse the Torah. The different arguments that were made in heaven. exoneration comes in Yutas Kislev, that Alter Rebbe, not only was he doing correctly, as the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid told him, you'll do even more. So this shouldn't be seen as some type of question on the Alter Rebbe's work. It's the heavenly forces that challenging the great Gilui, and whenever there's a great Gilui, there's going to be a resistance. That's how it is. Just like we talk about Napoleon. Why did Abish send on Napoleon in the first place? Because Alter Rebbe was doing things that were paving the way toward Geula Mashiach. Comes on Napoleon, a godless, representing godlessness, and his argument is that and the argument in heaven is an opposition like an Esav to Yaakov. Kishazeh comes and Nephil. And that was the challenge that they were facing. So the Alter Rebbe Take lost years of his life because of this, but he left us Chassidus Chabad, and he left us generations to come. And today, as the Rebbe explains, the seventh generation, we could do the transformation. So all this is all part of the bigger picture. Do we know? Oh no, was the opposition to the Alter Rebbe based on fear resulting from the Shabbatean movement? Someone writes, was some of the opposition to the Alter Rebbe not purposely malicious, but perhaps just out of a fear that the Hasidic movement might be another type of Shabbatean movement, Shabtai Tzvi, that is contrary to the Torah's ethos? It was less than 100 years after Shabtai Tzvi, and maybe people were afraid. Absolutely, that was part of it. Because they did not know. It's only being taught Kabbalah, Pnimis HaTeira, so there were those that were wary, and for good reason. However, it was proven otherwise. That on the contrary, Chassidus was bringing a new level of Yiras Shamayim, a new level of Avos Hashem, Yiras Hashem, after the fact. But of course, there was a certain element of that. The Yidden were in a deep dark galus. We know Yisrael. Why is Baal Shem Tov called Yisrael? It says because like Yisrael, calling the name of Am Yisrael, wakes them up from histalkus, from a comatose spiritual state. This was all part of why Chassidus was coming was being revealed. And this was all part of the Helamas Vestadim of the time. So that was also part of it, yes. Another few questions around the Alter Rebbe Chavdala Teves. Do we know why the Alter Rebbe was attracted to the teachings of Chassidus, which drove him to found Chabad Chassidus? Well, we know a few things for sure. We know the Alter Rebbe was a Gavaldik Kagon and Lamdan. And we know the Alter Rebbe even said that he had two choices, to go to Vilna to learn further, or to go to Mezrich, where the Maggid of Mezrich was, to learn how to daven. So he says, I've learned how to learn. Not that he couldn't learn more, of course he learned more. But to daven, he wanted to come to learn how to daven. This is one among different stories. Alter Rebbe, being a Gadol Shebegadol that he was, a giant, you could imagine learning Kol HaTeira Kula, he was eager to reach the ultimate. And the ultimate was not just Nigla HaTeira, but also Primis HaTeira. So when he had accessed it and began to learn it, you could imagine what kind of effect it had. I'm not speaking speculation now. So you're talking about a Ish Emes, a Ish Alikim, looking for godliness. So once he discovered, with the Maggid, there's a number of stories how he was about to leave Mezrich, but then he saw the Chidushim of the Maggid, especially in Limud HaTeira and Nigla too, that drew him, and he understood the bigger picture. So it's B'chlal, you'd be able to have all Chalkei HaTeira, Shnei Oyer, both levels of Oyer. That's part of what affected him. His father, we know, was a Talmud Nista, was a secret Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov told him, however, that he shouldn't introduce him to the Baal Shem Tov, the Alter Rebbe that is, because he belongs to the Maggid. So you see that there were also roots of Hasidic connections in the Alter Rebbe's childhood, for sure. I'm sure also contributed to different factors. But that's just a few basic principles, and there are probably more details. You look into the Sikhs, many more details of the Alter Rebbe's early years, early formative years, so to speak. Do we know why the Alter Rebbe's family surname changed from Pozner to Baruchovitch? Well, Pozner was a name based on the city of Poznan, where his grandparents came from, or great-grandparents, and therefore his father was named that way. We don't know whether the Alter Rebbe himself changed the name. Baruchovitch was another name because his father was also Baruch, and in Russia then it was customary to have a name that was like the son of, so to speak, Baruch. So probably both names were alternated. Later, the name would become Shneerson, son of Shneer, Shneer's son, Shneeyuri, and then Shneer's son. But I don't know if there's more information about it. But if somebody does have information, please share it, and I'll be happy to share it with the public. Okay. Who was the author of the maamorim and Torah or Likkutei that begin with the words LeTosfes Biur? So you'll find when you see Torah, Likkutei, you'll often see a maamar, a discourse. Remember, Torah, Likkutei is like one continuation. There's reasons why one is called this and the other is called Likkutei. But Torah basically covers all the Alter Rebbe's maamorim, or not all, that Tzemach Tzedek gathered from many thousands of over 2,000 maamorim. Torah is basically Bereshis till the end of Shmois, Vayakel. Likkutei begins with Pekudei. Has one maamar on Beshalach, Pekudei, and then goes Vayikra, Vamidbar, Dvarim, the Yom Tevim, and Shir HaShirim. So in the maamorim you'll find a maamar, it could be a beginning of a maamar, Vaeirah, or any other maamar, and then there'll be LeTosfes Biur, additional explanation, another maamar that begins with the words LeTosfes Biur. Sometimes a biur le biur, an explanation to an explanation. So the person is asking, who is the author of that biur? Is it part of the Alter Rebbe's original maamar, or later an explanation added by another Rebbe? So the answer is, the Alter Rebbe himself very often would say a maamar, often Friday night or Shabbos, or in Yom Tov, or Yom Pagra, or a Chasana, etc. And then later he would say a hemshech. He would say an explanation, sometimes the next Shabbos, sometimes the next day, sometimes the next the Shabbos after the Yom Tov. So the Teves Biur and the Biurim to the Biur is also the Alter Rebbe. Anything from the other Rabbeim, complete maamorim, would be printed, whether it's the Mittler Rebbe, by the Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek. Now we know that the Alter Rebbe didn't write his own maamorim. These were written by different manichim, namely his brother Mariel, Rabbi Yehuda Leib, that Mittler Rebbe wrote, Rabbi Moshe, another son of the Alter Rebbe, wrote, Rabbi Pinchas Reizes wrote, as well as the Tzemach Tzedek in later years. But and when the Tzemach Tzedek wrote, Rabbi Tzemach sometimes wrote Hagos and additions to the Alter Rebbe, but the Teves Biur generally is the Alter Rebbe. I don't think there are any exceptions. You'll have the Mittler Rebbe could take the same maamar and then write his own version of it, which would be much longer and much more explanatory, in addition to his Hanochas. So it's all from the Alter Rebbe. Okay. And finally, it's a follow-up to previous weeks. How can I support the printing of Torah and Likkutei in English? So, a few of you wrote to me about wanting to help support that. One person writes, "Hi Rabbi Jacobson, thank you for reading my letter which asked why the entire Likkutei hasn't been translated to English yet. I also offered to donate $1,000 to the publisher working on it to help speed up the process. You requested I send my email address so you can follow up and inform me where to send this donation. And the fellow gives me the email address, which I passed on out to Kahos. Thank you." Another person writes, "Dear Rabbi Jacobson, last Sunday you read a note from a person who asked why the Likkutei wasn't never fully translated to English, and the person said they would donate money to whomever is working on it. As someone whose native language is English and struggles often with Hebrew and Yiddish, I also would love to see it translated, and I would also like to make a donation to help fund it. If you can please announce who is working on it and how the public can donate, I would appreciate it. Thank you. So either send me your email address, or you can contact Kahos Publications Society. You can find it online, and I'm sure they'll be happy to get your support and help these projects come to fruition. And I'm glad to I feel honored, and I'm happy that this is a platform where people feel they can participate, and I can direct you to the right places, and we perhaps can get many projects done this way in printing a public Chassidus. And what better tribute than this to Dalet Teves, the Alter Rebbe's Yom Hilula. So with this, let's move to Parsha Vaeirah. Parsha Vaeirah. Being that we're talking about the Alter Rebbe, so let me begin right away. What is the story behind the maamar of the Alter Rebbe called the Frumer Vaeirah? So there's actually a maamar from the Alter Rebbe called Vaeirah. It's a maamar Vaeirah on this week's parsha. It's called the Frumer Vaeirah. So I may have spoken about this in the past, maybe not. I don't remember now. So I'll just give you a few little footnotes that I have on this. So the place Frumer Vaeirah that I've seen, and it could be in other places as well, is actually a footnote from the Rebbe. I'm looking at it right now. It's printed in Eira Teira Shmois, which is also Vaeirah. The Rebbe himself published this, meaning the Rebbe wrote many footnotes and prepared it for publication in the early years. I think it's, if I recall, Tafshin Yud. Chof Dalet Teves, The date in this sefer is Chof Dalet Teves Tafshin Yud. So this means before Yud Shvat. Right before Yud Shvat. Chof Dalet Teves, the Rebbe published this sefer. That I didn't recall. Okay, interesting. So it's Chof Dalet Teves. We're talking about Chof Dalet Teves. So in the first maamar of Vaeirah, the Rebbe writes to look in this maamar that's printed in Teira Eir, that was printed in Lemberg in the year Teira, which is the year Tov Reish Yud Aleph, Tzaddik Tzaddik's time. So there was a print of Likkutei Teira Eir, and he's telling us to look in that maamar. V'yadua, and that maamar is called B'Shem der Frumer Vaeirah. And the Rebbe tells us to look in a sikha from the Rebbe Rashab, Teira Shalom, page 86. And to also look in Pelach Hariman from the Reb Hillel Parashat also as well, on Pasuk, Al Sefer Shmeis, this Dibra Maskell, page 44. So let's look in Teira Shalom. Let's do this together. Interesting Teira Shalom. A sikha printed in Teira Shalom, page 86. It's the Suda Friday night, Parsha Vaeirah. Again, this week, the year appears to be Tov Reish Samach Zayin. That's what it looks like. Probably Samach Zayin, yeah. So he talks about, very interesting, he talks about how the Alter Rebbe, whatever he wrote and whatever he said, he was living, personally experiencing. He wasn't just writing the idea. He says he was in that Maimid HaMatzav. So if it was a matzah, it says it was a man of Moresh Cheda, he bepel mamish in the Moresh Cheda, sheikhen al pnei kol achsidim. Es is given meredik. That's what the Rebbe Rashab says. And if he was mesasik, he was involved in simcha, hoisa simcha nailis v'rabba meid meid. The joy was tremendously great. That's the story. He says that the name of the Rav Achosar Rab Moshe Leib of Barditchev, who was a grandson of Rab Leib Yitzchak Barditchev. So whatever the Alter Rebbe was involved in, that was the effect that it had on him and all the Chassidim. Says the Rebbe Rashab like this, interesting. Heint, was hat sich abgetan beis, the Rebbe hat gesagt, the Drush Vaeirah. What happened abgetan? How do you explain? What took place? What occurred when the Rebbe, meaning the Alter Rebbe, said the maamar, the Drush Vaeirah? And the Rebbe again, the footnote is this same Drush, printed in Teira Eir Lemberg. V'shmi Havaya, inyan ki lo yidach mamena nidach, es hat gor gemuz sein meire godel beis meise. There had to be a tremendous awe, a tremendous trembling, you could even say. B'shas meise. Ich bin nicht mekane, diva sein b'shas meise, dibru zeh gewen. I'm not envious of those that were there present when this dibur, when this maamar was said. Hadrush hazeh hu etzli ksav yad deidenu maril. I have this maamar in manuscript of our uncle Maril, the Fetter Leibele, he calls him. Maril is Yehuda Leib. So that was the brother of the Fetter Maril most likely is the brother of the Alter Rebbe, unless he means the Maril, the son of the Tzemach Tzedek. But why would it be in his handwriting? I think it means Maril. He calls him Fetter Leibele. V'tikunim shuris hachodes ksav yad kedesh kveit grushus rabbeinu hagodol ba'atzmei. So it's in his manuscript, the Maril, with tikunim. It's most likely the Alter Rebbe's brother, because he has tikunim on it. The Maril of the Tzemach Tzedek was many years later. And the Alter Rebbe has corrections on it in his Ksav Yad, in his holy handwriting. A Beis Chassidus, the Rebbe Rashab says, a Beis Chassidus, an angry Chassidus. Beis means angry. A very frightful Chassidus. Now, it doesn't mean angry in a negative way. It means very strong. Gor Meredik. Gor Meredik. Very awesome. But he doesn't make mention to the word Frumer Vaeirah. But the Rebbe does. So you could say it's a maamar that evoked a state of awe, a state of piety. I say to this, like he says, Meredik is say to this at the time. So this is Vaeirah, and the maamar we believe is said Tov Nun Dalet. Tov Nun Dalet would be equivalent to the year 1794. Would be Tov Nun Dalet, I believe. Yeah. Interesting. 200 years before Tov Nun Dalet. Chav Dalet, parsha Vaeirah, which is the week of the Alter Rebbe's histalkus. Years later, Chav Dalet Teves Tov Ayin Gimel. Okay. What lessons do we learn from living with the times with this week's Torah portion? So here we have right here a first lesson. That Vaeirah, the way the Alter Rebbe explained it, there, like he says, he's talking there about topics of that ultimately Shmi Havaya. Remember, parsha Vaeirah is the parsha where Moshe is told by Hashem in the beginning of the parsha that I have not revealed I only revealed myself with Kel Shaddai to the patriarchs, to the forefathers, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. But to you I will reveal Shmi Havaya. Shmi Havaya lo nadaiti lehem. But to you I will reveal it because you're now in the darkness, the abyss of Kerev Haaretz of Mitzrayim. So it's a very dark chapter, but it's also a very powerful chapter. So the first lesson we learn is no matter what we're going through, we have tremendous resources and faculties and strengths that we're given. Like Moshe was given Shem Havaya. Even though it says Chassidus, you see Shem Havaya also by the Ovis, but they call it Havaya de Latata. This is Havaya de Le'ela. The darker it is, the more strength you need, the deeper the revelation. Like the theme of Basar Legani, that to be Natseach, to be victorious in a war against an enemy, you get the Eitzes, the Bizbuz, the splurging of the highest level treasures that were never revealed. Like he says, Helam Atzmi, things that are fundamentally concealed. In Lamay Adein Ketz. As discussed, especially in this year's chapter 16 of the Hemshech, corresponding to the 16th chapter. I just did a class on it. I'll probably do a second part. You can find it online at chassidussupply.com. We have it on the link you can find where I did the class just a few days ago. And the ultimate chiddush there is that the deepest levels of Ein Sof, that it's completely concealed. Not just concealed relatively to us, but Sosim Be'etzem. That too is given into Ein Sof, which means we're given access to it, and ultimately the ability to execute it in our lives. But that's only due to the battles that we have to fight. Similar to the very theme of Parsha Vaeirah. What do the four expressions of redemption refer to? as we continue on the parsha. Do the four expressions of Gealti and so on represent the different levels of revelation to the worlds of Atzilus, Bri, Yetzir, and Asiya? The answer is yes. And just to continue the theme, remember, we're dealing now with Mitzrayim, as the Arizal says, Likkutei Arizal, he talks about that Mitzrayim's Reish Kol HaGolius, that's the Medrash says that. It's the Keser. The other Golius are also very powerful. Bovel, Parasamodai, Persia, Yavan, Greece, Edom, the Roman Empire. Sometimes we also include the Yishmael, Malchus Yishmael, the Ishmaelite empires. But it all begins with Golus Mitzrayim. So it was the deepest and darkest Golus. And as such, we get the deepest strengths to free ourselves from there. That's coming from, like I said, Lamai Lamai Aden Ketz. And Pare, in its root, is Pariu Minei Kol Nehurin. So Pare Lamata is the Tan HaGadol, is the ultimate of Shalosh Klippos Atmeis, the darkest of the dark. But in his root, the lower he is below, the root is that from there Pariu is also a splurging of the greatest energies from above. But it doesn't just remain above, it has to be nimshach through all the elements. So that's why you have the four loshenis of Geula. That it goes through all the elements, Atzilus, Abri, Yetzir, and Asiya. So these great revelations don't just remain up in the highest levels, they become implemented and permeate existence itself, the whole Seder histalkus. Relevant to our discussion, that's one thing we can learn from that. What is the deeper meaning of Aaron's rod, Mata Aaron, turning into a nochash, a snake, Tanin, and swallowing the rods of the Egyptian sorcerers? Is it a metaphor that Hashem always protects us and that the spiritual and physical weapons we have will be able to swallow the weapons of our enemies and we will be safe? Obviously, that's a very practical and obvious lesson. Because it wasn't just enough to avoid Egypt, it was to transform. Now we know a nachash represents a negative thing. Right away conjures up the first nachash HaKadmeni, the serpent in the Garden of Eden, that represents the Yetzer Hara, represents everything negative. Serpent. Mata Aaron is Aaron's rod, represents Kedusha, holiness. He's walking with the staff. Mata Moshe, the staff of Moshe, the staff of Aaron. So what the Eibishter showed was, no, this staff is not just a Kedusha. It can enter the world of the Nachash. It can become a Nachash, just like the Nachash HaKadmeni, just like the Tanin HaGadol. Pari was called Tanin HaGadol, the great serpent. Some say like the great alligator, but it's a serpent. It's a reptile, great reptile. So the Tanin becomes, the Mata becomes a Tanin. And furthermore, not only can it enter the world of Klippos, it swallows the Klippa itself of the Khartumei Mitzrayim, meaning Pare's sorcerers. So it was all hinting to the transformation that not only will we overcome and free ourselves from you, from Mitzrayim, Mitzrayim v'Gvulim and all its limitations, we'll actually swallow and transform it into Kedusha. And turning back into a mata, a staff, a rod that leads the people into the Gula, into the Gulas Mitzrayim. That's the basic symbolism of that. Why did God send 10 plagues and not just one plague to convince Pare? At the end of the day, he was going to send Makas B'cheres, which was finally the thing that pushed it over, and Pare finally agreed to let the Mitzrayim go, let the Jews go. Why do you need to go through step by step and all these? Do we know why God sent 10 plagues upon it when God could have just sent one massive plague to get the job done faster, so we could have exited the suffering of slavery much quicker? So it goes back to the same theme that we've been discussing throughout this program. It's not enough just to free ourselves; it's to transform. Why didn't God right away allow the Alter Rebbe's times, we should be able to transform France. And the Alter Rebbe did not have to avoid Napoleon. Because that's the Havaya. First you need a Biur. Yaakov wanted Esav to be Nizbarer, refined, but he wasn't ready yet. This is the long process of history. And the same here. Mitzrayim was not enough just to get the Jews out of there. It was to redeem all the sparks from there. Erev Rav Olimam, they came with the Erev Rav, 202 sparks that were elevated from Mitzrayim. And this is a process. You want Mitzrayim to come to recognize. Because the whole goal is making a dira b'tachtenim. It's not just a matter of getting out of the slavery. Why did Abish to lead the Jews into Mitzrayim in the first place? Why do we need a famine that caused Yaakov and his family, 70 souls, to come down to Mitzrayim? Why did God want that? They were in Eretz Yisrael. Because that's the kavanah, a biur ha-tachten. The refinement of the tachten. The refinement of the tachten is a step-by-step process. As I explained in the class I gave on Bos Ligani, why do you start with lamata mata aden tachlis lamay lamay aden ketz? Because first you have to do the giluyim. The Rebbe says first the anplekta. First we have to receive the revealed energies, and then we come to the hidden ones. It's a step-by-step process. And here too, a step-by-step promise. 10 makkahs, each makkah refining another part of Mitzrayim, as it says in Svarim, and Chassidus brings it. The Rebbe discusses it. That the makkahs affected the Dalet Yesodis, meaning Eish Ruach Mayim offer, fire, air, water, and earth, and also the Yesod, the Yesod Atzmi, the fifth core element that's behind all of them, because it was meant to refine. That's why we say in the Haggadah we talk about how many makkahs there were, even though there were 10, but there are different opinions whether it's 40 or 50, the 4 or 5, 10 times 4 or 5, because it meant to refine every aspect, every fiber of the klipa of Mitzrayim. Okay. Now there were a few questions asked about Parsha Shmeis, so let's do that. I'm going to do a few more. Let me see what we have here time-wise. Okay, we'll see how much time we have. We'll try to cover as much as we can. The next question is, do we know the original names of Moshe given to him by his parents? Since Parsha Vaeirah comes after Parsha Shmeis, so I'll do a few from Parsha Shmeis that came in. We know that Moshe was 90 days old when when the daughter of Pare found his basket floating down the river, and she named him Moshe, because she drew him out of water. But when he was 8 days old, he would have had a bris, and be given a Hebrew name by his parents. Do we know what his original Hebrew name was, and why the Torah chooses to call him Moshe, not his original name? So, firstly, I spoke about this, I believe I'm trying to remember, I think it was episode 290. I may be wrong with that, but episode 290. But I'll say briefly the answer. So you look in the Gemara and Seita, V'ikar Rabba, Megillah, in Pirkei Rabbi Elazar, a few other places, Seder Aderes, and we do actually see the names. There are different opinions. There's the name Tuiv or Tuvia. There's in one place 10 names: Yered, Chaver, Yukusil, Avigdar, Avi, Sukkah, Zanuach, Tuvia, Shmaya, Levi, Moshe. And there's another place where Amram called him Chaver, Kohas, his grandfather called him Avigdar. Bottom line is we have many names, and most of them we have no clue. Most of us don't even know their names. Moshe becomes his name. So Chassidus elaborates why. Because it wasn't just he drew him out of water. It represented, what Moshe represented was the world of water, the world of Machshava, Alma Diskasi, the hidden worlds. As the Alter Rebbe explains in Teves, he came from another reality. And the goal was to draw from that reality into the world of Dibur, of Alma Disgalia. So she gave him the name, she prophetically knew that the name was fitting what his person would be like. As elaborated in Chassidus on this topic. If you go to that episode, you'll have more details. Okay. Next question. How did Moshe find out that he was Jewish? I seem to be getting this question from quite a few people. I heard this question at least 3-4 times this week. Since Moshe was raised by the Egyptian palace since he was a baby, and he was told Basia was his mother and Pharoah was his grandfather, when did he find out he was really Jewish, and who told him? Well, In Parsha Shmos, you see that when he goes out, it says to see among his echav, among his brothers, see how they're suffering. So clearly he was aware. So firstly, based on a balabatish level, Moshe was an intelligent man. We know, not only intelligent, he was most intelligent in all of history. The man that would be chosen by Hashem to give the Torah, to bring the Torah, and so on. He knew what was going on in Egypt. There were Jews being enslaved. So besides everything else, I'm sure he made his inquiries. Didn't have to necessarily be announced. Secondly, his hergesh hanefesh. He sensed, he felt. That neshama like Moshe. So no matter where he grew up, he had the sense. Even as a child, we know he already was pulling off the crown of Pharoah. So if a person like that had the sense, you can imagine he had a sense like that. Do we know whether he was actually formally told or not? That I have to find, I don't know, it could be in Midrashim, it talks about it. If anybody knows more information, by all means. But it was clear when he saw the Mitzri hitting the Jew and killing the Jew, that he knew that this was affected him. That's why he went. He didn't just see it. He did something about it. So he clearly knew where he was coming from. And that would be the most basic answer for that. What lessons can we learn from Moshe's childhood in Pharaoh's palace? Well, remember, Menea be'aba lishde be'narga, you cut down a tree with the very wood of the axe that comes from the tree. Moshe, being in Pharaoh's palace, was part of the hisapche. That yes, he grew up in that very place, that he would ultimately be the one that transformed and destroyed, for that matter. So that's overall. The details of what we know is, of course, the famous story of I mentioned the crown. And Pharaoh's superstition was that he was afraid that Moshe is a little baby. He's taking off the crown of Pharaoh. It means he was a threat to him. So you have, of course, the three advisors. Bilam said, kill the child immediately. He's a danger. The Yisrei said, it's just a child. He's not doing anything wrong. It's just, child is just by accident happened to pull off your crown. Don't read into it. And Eev was the one that said, test it. Put a plate of jewels and precious stones on one place, and one side put hot coals on another, and let's see what the child does. Moshe was about to reach for the precious stones, came a malach, moved his hand, and he grabbed the coal, and like a child, he put the coal to his mouth. And that caused, that called the Rals Vasayim, Lo yish dvarim anechi, kvad peh, kvad loshen, that Moshe's speech impediment, so to speak. So this story has many, many meanings in it. Firstly, Moshe already had an instinct of what is going to be. Secondly, the Eibishter knew he wanted him to not be ish dvarim anechi, because misam pel la'adam, Hashem would put the words in his mouth, and by Matan Torah he would be healed. But a famous sikha from the Rebbe, Gimel Shvat, printed today, said the sikha of Boy, Tov Shin Nun Beis, a few weeks before the stroke. The Rebbe speaks about Moshe not being able to speak. Like a stroke, like the Frierdiker Rebbe stroke, because it comes from Elam HaMachshava, like we said, the world of water. But all that comes back down to the bottom line, that this all part of what shaped Moshe to be able to achieve what he had to achieve. Let's see here now. So with the time that's left, let's just cover a few more things. I was going to talk about Yud Shvat Basiligani, but I'll save that for next week. What are we to make of the uprisings in Iran? Okay. So firstly, all events that happen in the world obviously matter to the Jewish people, to God, regarding God's bigger plan, especially when it comes from a place like that in the world. Iran is Paras of old, or Babylon even, Paras, Babylon. And when you start looking into the Midrashim, especially the Medrash the Rebbe brought about that a Melech Paras will attack a Melech Arvi, which at the time was Iraq, but Iraq, Iran in this context can be interchangeable. So you're talking about events that took place thousands of years ago. Story of Purim is in Paras, in Persia. And in the many different nevuos and the different statements made in Midrashim, in Zohar, talks about the end of days will be the confrontations with this part of the world. And ultimately the Geula will come. Higiyaz man Geulaschem. And we shouldn't be afraid. So when you see uprisings happening in Iran, immediately that's what it leads to. Reminding us of the bigger cosmic plan. How does it reflect on the bigger scheme of the future? That's how it reflects. Since we're talking about Napoleon, we're talking about Russia, we're talking about the confrontations of civilizations, of nations, whether it's Edom, or Esav is Edom, or Yishmael, which is these countries. So it's all part of the bigger scheme that we're talking about the end of days, where it all comes together, and like the Rebbe quoted Yalkut Shmeni, Yigiyaz man Geulaschem. And the main thing is not to be afraid. So these uprisings are a very clear sign that things are going to change. Exactly how, nobody knows exactly. Someone asked the question, did the Rebbe make any public statements about Iran during the 1979 Islamic Revolution that we can learn from today? So I tell you the truth, I didn't have time to really look it up back then. I think the Rebbe did mention it, but I want to look it up more in detail. But there's no question in Tafshin Nun Aleph, with the Persian Gulf War, with Iraq, the Rebbe Beferish mentioned and brought the Yalkut Shmeni. And this is all part of that, again, that region. I did write extensively about this, especially in connection to Purim, because Purim is the story. Purim, Iran today wants to call for the Rahman al-Islam annihilation of Israel and Jews. That's what Haman and Purim was about. And then comes Yehudim Mesa Erev V'Simcha V'Sastim Yekar, and that's still Akata Avda Dachashverosh Hanan. And now will be the total Geula that will come out of all of this. So there's no doubt that the Rebbe spoke about this in his own way, as I said, 1991. But I want to go back and see if it was in 1979, whether there's any sikhs. Again, if anybody has information, please tell me, share with me. I'll look it up as well, and I'll share my findings. So maybe this is a good place to conclude. Yeah, it's a good place to conclude as we approach Dalet Teves. And the Alter Rebbe was Mesa Nefesh, and especially Mesa Nefesh in fighting the battles against Edom, that it should all the coordinates should be in place, that there would become the day when we could be Mavared Edom. And now we're also dealing with the Biur of Yishmael, meaning all the countries there. This is what is all this, the Zohar, Seif Parsha Vaeirah, Seif Parsha Bolok, and many Midrashim, and many are hinted to, the Balaturim at the end of Parsha Chayesara, all talk about how at the end of days there will be the confrontation between these major, the Bnei Esav, the Bnei Yishmael, Bnei Yisrael, and ultimately be Yisrael, Yisrael, the Geula Amitis V'Ashlema. So we are on the verge of that. That doesn't mean it's all finished yet. And yes, we've had some setbacks, we've had some cheshach, but it's all leading toward that direction. So in the schus of the Alter Rebbe, schus of Chassidus Chabad, schus of all the Rabbeim, the Rashvi is the Shvi from the Alter Rebbe, that we should finish the job and should come the Geula Mitis V'Ashlema V'hu Yigalenu, with the Bizbuz HaEtzris, the splurging of the treasures that are being given to us for fighting these final battles, from the deepest places that illuminate the darkest, lowest part of the world, the Geula Amitis V'Ashlema. This has been my life, Chassidus applied, hopefully part of the battle of Yefutza Ma'anesecha Chutza, bringing light that dispels darkness. We're here every Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m. Everyone be blessed. Kol Tuv.
This program is brought to you by My Life, Chassidus Applied. Please help us continue our programs. Make even a small contribution at chassidusapply.com/donate.